Broken dishes, doors flying off their hinges, a leaking bathtub, shards of glass on the floor, and a cornered bedroom. "Nancy, is this your fault? Get out of my house!" "Intending to," screamed the restless stepmother. The enraged woman was into the next room, but even from there, Nancy could sense her stepmother's readiness to pounce on her with a knife at any moment. The 17-year-old girl sat on the floor, unable to calm her confused breathing, or the lump of tears coming to her throat. But Nancy's mind wandered from one dark corner of her subconscious to another, like a hermitage wanderer through the woods in search of a fresh river. Nancy, on the other hand, tried to search her memory for echoes of the past that influenced what was now happening in her late father's apartment. From the hallway, the stern voice continued to come, exasperated with her stepmother. She was scurrying back and forth across the apartment, never ceasing to shout that Nancy had spoiled her already miserable life. At this time, the girl, immersed in memories, was thinking about what might have led to the Nancy and the scandal. The girl's father, Charles, had died quite recently, without having had time to say a proper farewell to his daughter. Charles made a lousy parent. He worked on watch as a department head, and when he returned home, he went deep and long into a drunkenness. Until the death of his biological mother, Nancy Miranda, Charles had never picked up a bottle of alcohol. And now he was drinking even at work in his office with a woman named Molly, Nancy's current stepmother. Charles hoped that he could find happiness with a woman again. But the longing for his first wife haunted him throughout each day. Molly did not help the suffering man at all, but only wailed, "You don't love me if you only think about her." Over time, Nancy's father realized that Molly married him solely out of mercantile motives. After all, Charles brought home a huge amount of money, most of which he immediately gave to his wife. Charles did not divorce his wife even after he learned the truth about her intentions for him. He saw no sense in it, nor did he see the meaning of the rest of his life. Neither money nor family ties brought him happiness. Even alcohol did not make a man happy, as it might seem at first glance. Charles lived only to work. The half of the year he spent in his hometown was just a fleeting dream for the man, spent from which he would leave again to supervise the workers on watch drinking 5-year-old whiskey hidden behind the red door of his office. Nancy's life has changed a lot since her stepmother came along. If before she was not dared to touch her, then after Molly had all the rights to custody of her stepdaughter, physical punishment for the girl became something commonplace. For the slightest disobedience, Nancy was beaten with a belt or a jump rope, put in a corner for several hours, and then did not talk to the girl for a long time. When the father came home, Molly became indulgent to encourage. Charles strictly forbade his wife to touch his daughter, really until the man was drunk to the point of not being able to. Nancy got used to constant beatings, and by the age of 17 had learned to fight back against Molly or stay out of sight. The woman liked to keep control over Nancy, to set ultimatums to the unfortunate child for which failure to comply would be punished. Sometimes the stepdaughter even seemed more displeased with the stepmother. Not because of the fact that Nancy did not fulfill any of the listed points, but because the girl did everything perfectly, and Molly has nothing to do but to get away from Nancy because of such a strict upbringing on the part of the stepmother, who apparently did not even try to bring up the stepdaughter. In fact, it seemed as if the woman simply enjoyed bullying Nancy. The girl began early to drink alcohol and smoke cigarettes. Already from the 6th grade, she knew with what it was better to mix highly joyful alcohol and which saleswoman in the stall, that is behind the school, closed her eyes to the age of buyers. Several times a drunken Nancy, standing up the doorstep, was met by her stepmother, who reeked of an untimely calmness to the point of arousing a sense of dread. Teenage girls. Nancy, understandable. Getting an iron buckle on her legs. But that only made the girl's hatred for Molly end, and Nancy never stopped behaving the way she did. To further ruin her stepmother, and show that Molly would never have power over her stepdaughter. One summer evening, while her father was at home, Nancy was invited to a club by her friend and part-time Bosworth classmate. Nancy had just turned 17 at the time, but the young girls had visited nightclubs many times, especially the one they were about to go to. That night, Bosworth taught Nancy how to forge passport photos and introduced her to some people who could help with security. It was then that Nancy saw how useful it really was to have the right connections. The girl thought that she could ask her father for time off and not get in too much trouble from Molly later on. So Nancy decided to do just that, turning the corner of the living room. The girl met her parent sitting in a familiar position, sprawled out on the couch with the shin of one leg over his knee, the other man leisurely drinking a beer in his hand. After informing her father of her visit, Nancy moved closer and took in the underground conversation. "I have a night out with a friend tonight, a vacation planned." Nancy made the most pitiful eyes she was capable of. The man was about to reply when suddenly Molly burst into the room. "What kind of night out with a friend?" howled in the woman, getting drunk as a pig again. "And you're going to come home dead drunks." "What do you care?" "I want and got drunk," rudely replied the stepdaughter. The stepmother had not expected the bickering on Nancy's part, and turning her eyes round with surprise on her husband, she shouted, letting out a hysterical laugh. "You look at her." Pointing with her palm to the side, Nancy shouted Molly pretending to be an adult, when in fact she is a silly girl who doesn't know anything about life. Not hearing Charles's response to her disgruntled exclamation, Molly turned to the girl again. "I wish the best for you. That's why I'm not letting you go anywhere." It sounded from the woman's lips as if she was forcing these words out of herself in order to prove herself to her husband, to make her own daughter look guilty in his eyes. Nancy did not continue to argue with her stepmother because she knew it would take a long time, but it would get her nowhere. Both women stared at Charles, waiting for his decision. The man sighed heavily, and a couple moments later, his hoarse voice rang out, "Go," Charles said, and instantly fell asleep. "See?" Nancy exclaimed, throwing a scornful glance at her stepmother. The girl ran off to get ready, but just as she was about to close the door to her own room behind her, Molly came in. "What do you want?" "Stroganoff, either from fear or from surprise," said Nancy. "You think you're the smartest? You're not going anywhere?" Disdainfully threw in the direction of her stepdaughter. "The woman." "Why is that?" Mocking her stepmother, Nancy asked. "Because that's what I've decided. Cut Molly off. How have you still not figured it out?" "I don't care about your decisions," Nancy exclaimed, lashing out angrily at the woman. Nancy started to push Molly closer to the exit, but she only laughed hysterically. "Your daddy can't help you now. You can't wake up that old drunk even if you pour a bucket of ice water on his head," shrieked the stepmother, taunted. Nancy shoved the woman with all her might, and this staggered, nearly falling, catching her hand on the door jamb. A fierce fire lit up in Molly's eyes, and she lashed out at the face. Nancy flinched and bounced to the side, almost meeting a slap from her negligent stepmother. Molly grabbed the girl by the throat, causing them both to fall to the floor, hovered over her, and whispered into her face. "You're trying to show me that you're not afraid to show me that you're not vulnerable in front of me. Now know that you're only succeeding because I'm allowing this animal." The terror you feel at the sight of me can be felt from afar. Nancy spat in Molly's face in response to what she said, and immediately felt the heat on her cheek from instantly coming for the crack. "Cunt!" shouted the stepmother. The woman had to let her stepdaughter go. Hurriedly rising from her knees, Molly wiped the wet spot with the back of her palm. And again, Nancy. Nancy huddled against the wall from the walk, just like a cornered cat. Molly was apparently satisfied with the girl's reaction, and the woman hurried into the bathroom to talk as she walked. "Well, stick with me," as soon as the stepmother disappeared out the doorway. Nancy immediately jumped up and, grabbing her clothes and a small purse, ran outside and changed her clothes. Nancy in the next doorway, after which, having apologized, with Bosworth, rushed straight to the nightclub. Bosworth was already waiting for her at the main entrance. "What took you so long?" asked her friend. "It's a freak! Are they after me again?" Nancy exclaimed hatefully. Bosworth exhaled ironically, taking another drag from his cherry cigarette. "Give me a smoke, too." "This madhouse is making me dizzy," Nancy asked. Bosworth reached into her purse, pulled out a pack of cherry-flavored cigarettes, and held it open for Nancy. Taking one cigarette out of the package, the girl brought it to her lips and flicked a lighter in front of her nose. Lit it. "You haven't had time to put on makeup, I see," slid over Nancy, an appraising glance pronounced Bosworth. Nancy didn't say anything, just rolled her eyes, taking another drag of nicotine into her lungs. "It's okay. I brought my makeup bag with me," Bosworth declared festively. "I can't have my best friend showing up to the party as a gray mouse." Nancy smiled defiantly, looking his selves in the eye. Both girls then put out their cigarette butts on the ledge of a specially designed trash can and headed inside the club. There they were met by a familiar security guard who had seen Nancy here more than once, feigning a couple of phrases with the guy. The girls went through the turnstile. It was very stuffy inside, but usually Nancy knew firsthand the lack of oxygen stops being so noticeable. After a couple of cocktails, it did. Not noticing anything and nobody around, the friends spun to the music and often ran up to the bar to take a couple more sips of alcohol and run back to the dance floor. Soon a young man approached the girls, intending to get acquainted. He whispered something in their ear, not taking his eyes off Nancy, hanging on. Accepted it from the boys as well. Swept her gaze over him from top to bottom. Squeamishly wrinkled his nose and laughed. "With you?" disdainfully exclaimed she. "You've seen yourself." Aggression appeared on the boy's face, but he quickly suppressed it. He made another attempt at familiarity. "Boyko." "Yes, I even like it." The young man smiled with one edge of his lips. Bosworth continued dancing, turning her back to the guy and pretending not to notice him. A sly grin froze on the girl's face. Nancy guessed what her friend was doing, but did not dare to interfere. "Don't lie," Bosworth said without turning around, plausibly accidentally touching the guy's leg with her thighs.
"Not lying," mechanically said the guy, and wrapped his arms around his waist. Evicted, lightly running his fingers along her thigh as if mesmerized. Bosworth's dance did indeed look like some kind of ritual, as if the girl had deliberately brought the Casikfeitadel lane. Montragevirasin, man out for her own purposes. That was the case, however. The girl abruptly turned around to face the boy, his hands still resting on her waist and disembodied. Nancy stiffened at the realization of how close the two were to each other. She had never liked this kind of lovemaking. To Nancy, it was nothing but shameless and baseless. A flirtation with no future. "You'll prove it," Bosworth muttered flirtatiously, playfully twirling the blonde bow of her hair around her finger. "I'll prove it," exhaled the boy, lowering his eyes to the girl's lips. Bosworth laughed, pushing the boy gently. He didn't resist, but continued to touch her waist with just his fingertips. Bosworth lifted her head and caught the boy's gaze, lingering on it for a while, as if suggesting something to the young man, then nestled against his ear. Rising on her toes and saying something that Nancy could no longer make out, the guy nodded, and picking him up again, took her by the waist and led her away towards the bar. Nancy realized that her friend might not be waiting under her feet, in her head. The girl stepped back against the wall to take a little breather. Suddenly, a stranger approached her. "Are you here alone?" he said, staggering a little because of the hop. "Not one. Not even turning around at the voice."
Nancy replied gloomily. Well, the girl's gaze was turned towards the bar, where Bosworth and a young man unknown to Nancy were seated on round stools. And with whom? With a lad, was it? Again the stranger asked. And Nancy turned her gaze to the young man standing next to her, expecting to see an unkempt, pimply-faced runt, but a completely different picture appeared before her. The guy was very drunk, probably as drunk as he was handsome. His dark hair was neatly styled like Johnny Depp's in his youth. A few drunken smacks lingered on the young man's forehead, but it only added to his image of charm. He was tall, standing over the girl, leaning his elbow on the wall, and in his other hand he had a glass with some sort of crimson-colored liquid. The guy wore eyebrow piercings and, as it later turned out, Nancy tongue piercings. The girl was already drunk and caught herself thinking that for more than 30 seconds, she was continuously looking at the stranger, looking at his face, shoulders, arms, chest. Would you like a taste? The guy handed Nancy a glass with his drink. The girl looked at the guy and at the cocktail in surprise, hesitating to put her lips around the tube and drink the unfamiliar alcohol. The guy waited patiently. It was as if time had slowed down. Only he was left, clearly looking into each other's eyes as if trying to say something all-important. Nancy cast one last glance at her friend, continuing to chat casually with the young stranger, as if Nancy had come here alone. Nancy was attacked by bitterness and despair. She felt like a nobody, a lonely soul standing before the devil himself, holding out to her the apple of discord. Drunk alcohol only intensified the girl's feelings, and she snatched the glass from the hands of a strange guy and emptied it to the bottom in a matter of seconds. That's expensive, the guy said. Everything that happened afterwards was like a fog for the girl. Coming closer to the bar, Nancy did not find Bosworth there. A friend, too, can you imagine? Getting pretty drunk, she began to talk. Nancy left me here, just as my father once left me in the care of that old purse. Nancy drank and talked non-stop to the guy about her unfortunate fate, being the daughter of an alcoholic father. This went on until the girl wanted to go to the bathroom. I'll be right there, Nancy informed her, holding onto the bar to keep from falling over. The girl had no recollection of reaching the restroom and faintly remembered the moment when she was grabbed by the arm by a recent companion, apparently following her, and dragged into one of the stalls. Nancy was terribly drunk, but she offered no resistance for more than that reason. She wanted to prove to everyone that she was no longer a child and had the right to have fun, to live the life she wanted, not stand in a corner at a party, watching her friend playfully flirt with a strange guy who enjoyed her company so much. Whether this was Nancy's desire or an impulse for intimacy with anyone whose roots grew out of this resentment she had developed toward the world, even she herself did not know. Nancy felt neither worry nor pleasure. At times, she passed out, but a sudden jolt brought the girl back to the hated reality. Clinging tightly to the boy's shoulders, as if grasping for the slightest hope of being needed by anyone, Nancy dreamed of only one thing she wanted this night to be her last. He kept trying to get me into bed, but I was relentless. And when I realized he was running out of patience and money to pay for my cocktails, I hurried out of there. I tried to find you, but apparently you left as soon as we broke up. Bosworth's voice sounded from the phone speakers. Nancy sat on the couch, listening to her friend's voice, recounting an impression of last night. Nancy had no recollection of how she had gotten home last night, but soon a new message from an unknown person popped up on her smartphone screen. Clicking on the notification, and Nancy was transported to a new dialogue with a certain girl. I thought you'd forget to text me, an unfamiliar female voice sounded. The voice when you wake up tells you it's okay. Who is it? Sent a typed message to Nancy. The user read the message immediately. The reply didn't have to wait long either. In the next minute, a new voice message arrived on Nancy's phone. The girl pressed the play button. The voice came out of the Suriare's receiver again. I didn't think it was that bad. The girl grinned. I'm an employee of the club where you were lying yesterday, and here are the keys. We managed to get your address and send you home. We exchanged numbers too, just in case. You promised to write to me, but apparently you were so drunk that you don't remember it. But, no matter what, I'm glad you're okay. The message was interrupted, but the recipient sent a new one. And don't take drinks out of other people's hands or leave yours anywhere. It'll end badly. Ready to bet your drink? Did something get in the way? With undisguised suspicion, said the girl, having finished the monologue. Nancy thanked the stranger and dared to ask her name. It turned out that the girl's name was Christina. They talked for a bit longer before ending the conversation. Christina turned out to be a very nice conversationalist and told Nancy that she would be happy to see her again at the establishment. The memories were hazy. It was as if Nancy was looking into a muddy puddle, trying to catch a glimpse of a diamond. And as this one stepped out over the puddle, a heavy wheel passed over it, squeezing the shiny stone deeper into the mud. At first, the girl thought that it was because of the liquor she had drunk that all her memories were jumbled together, and many were lost forever. But thinking over Christina's words, Nancy began to realize that yesterday she had been in a state of mental confusion, and it was not at all like a state of strong alcoholic intoxication. The effect of the drink was similar to that of a narcotic type, only very strange. As if for some time you, leaving your body, fly into oblivion, and from there you look at everything that happens through a cloudy veil, like patched glass. You do not remember yourself or the people around you, but your body continues to behave naturally, like the body of a chicken, which is able to move around for a few minutes after deprivation of its head. The horrifying comparison filled Nancy's thoughts, but that they were interrupted by the sudden sound of the door opening. Up to this moment, Nancy had been alone in the apartment. She was unable to recall the moment when she had been met on the doorstep by a disgruntled Molly, and had tried in her usual scandalized manner of speech to convey something to Nancy. The girl seemed to be unconscious, in a kind of state of being stuck. In the morning, understandably, her whole body was sore and bruised, and it was not clear what it was, either from the events of last night, or maybe from the fact that Molly still dared to test her helpless stepdaughter with punishment. The door to Nancy's room opened, and her stepmother entered, with Nancy's father peering out from behind her. Well, have you been out for a walk? Molly cast a venomous glance at the girl with undisguised disdain. Nancy wanted to say something, but her father intervened. Leave us, Molly. Let me talk to my daughter. Nancy and Charles's wife fell into a brief stupor of surprise. It seemed to be the one moment when Nancy's father was not drunk. Molly perked up and looked at her husband in bewilderment, but he didn't even turn his head toward her, still staring at his daughter. He mumbled something confused and inarticulate. The woman retreated to her room. The father sat down on the couch where Nancy was seated and said, I know you hate me. Oh, he began. Nancy remarked animatedly with her head, still unable to utter a word. Do you hate me? The man continued. But I hate myself more than all of you put together. Charles hung his head, his trembling fingers nervously adjusting the pillow lying next to him, and he spoke again. I hate myself most of all for loving you, but I keep feeling sorry for myself and not interfering. He raised his head and looked Nancy straight in the eyes. I'd rather hate you. Tears started to come to Nancy's eyes, but she didn't dare move. Charles, noticing the longing in his daughter's face, moved closer and put his arm around Nancy, over his shoulders. He lifted his hand and began, stroking Nancy's hair. Such a simple fatherly gesture caused Nancy to let her emotions out. resting her nose against the man's shoulder. She began to sob quietly. "Don't cry, daughter. I am so weak and pathetic that I am not worthy of your tears. I feel that my end will soon come. I'll leave you forever, but I'll be glad of it. I will be glad that I can no longer feel the suffocating despair and guilt I feel for you. I'm nothing to you." But let it remain just words. Though who knows, I actually wish myself eternal misery in hell. Then I would fully feel the punishment for my inaction, for letting things go without thinking of you. My father's bitter speeches burned even more than the blows with a jump rope from the wicked stepmother Nancy wanted to scream. To talk sense into my father. To tell him that she loved him immensely and wanted to help him make things right. But the girl wouldn't let herself open her mouth out of blind hope to shut herself off from the waterfall of despair. Nancy suddenly felt that for the first time in months, she could open her heart and live all those feelings she had long hidden deep inside. It was painful. Nancy could almost physically feel the burning in her chest, as if the door that opened her soul had already fused with her flesh. But Nancy continued to tear at the tendons just to let out the emotions that had built up inside. Pain, hatred, fear, deep sorrow, tears not sparing, broke out everything without a trace in its path until the girl felt gratitude. May it have been painful, frightening, unbearably dreary. But this was where Nancy needed it most right now, was there for her, even if he hadn't been around all this time. But now he was here. Even if it was for the last time. He may not have been willing to move mountains for Nancy. He may not have been willing to be the best father he could be. But he was honest with her. As honest as anyone could be. It is not known how long they sat. So also Charles from time to time recalled events of the past, when his first wife, the girl's mother, was still alive, and they were a happy, complete family. Nancy was affected at times by either, but both, or from the realization that her life had once been quite different. Soon, they had to pull away from each other. Her father looked at his daughter with a kind of sorrow, as if apologizing, and then silently left the room. Nancy wanted to stop him, but she restrained her impulse, mentally letting go, forgiving him for all the pain he had caused her. Nancy cried all night, realizing that such an encounter with her father would never happen again. She would have to let him go because tomorrow she would see Charles again behind the bottle, sprawled on the sofa in the living room and hardly beggarly in conversation. Toward morning, the girl was possessed by sleep. The days of the week passed. Nancy suddenly began to notice a clear change in herself. The girl ate almost nothing, but nevertheless she gained weight. One day Nancy woke up to the fact that she was violently nauseated from her body. A fine shiver ran up her spine. Then, squatting near the toilet, suspicions of pregnancy crept into the girl's head. All the signs were there: deterioration of digestion, delayed menstruation, nausea and vomiting, often variable body temperature, and many other minor changes in the body, which Nancy tried hard to ignore. Using a pregnancy test, Nancy only confirmed her hunch. The indicator showed 2 stripes. The girl was afraid to tell anyone, so she thought of nothing better to do than to find the guy from the club and put him through the hardships of parenthood. Nancy didn't even think about abortion. She was afraid of losing the possibility of becoming a mother in the future because of the peculiarities of her body or the negligence of doctors, so she sent Christina a text message asking for help in finding a tall brunette. Nancy paced nervously around the room, waiting for a reply. After a while, a message came from the bar. Less luck was on Nancy's side, because she found out that the father of her child was a regular at the club, and this evening was not. A treatment immediately, not a moment more. Nancy began to pull herself together as it had been planned in her mind. Approaching a guy at the party, she bluntly announced to him that she was pregnant. Not reacting in any way, the young man continued to dance. Then Nancy took him by the sleeve and pulled him down so that his ear was at the level of her lips. "You got me pregnant!" shouted the girl, ignoring the loud music, which was also loudly questioned by the boy looking around. Nancy took the dark-haired young man under her arm and dragged him towards the exit. Just before the very doors, the guy, regaining his senses, began to resist. "Where are you taking me?" "Abnormal? Breaking out of the strong grip of the girl," he asked. The young people were already far enough away from the dance floor to be able to talk without their voices breaking. So Nancy said, "I'm pregnant with your baby." "What?" the guy exclaimed. "Are you kidding me?" With a visible reproach in his gaze, the young man began to examine the girl, scrutinizing her face. "You," without hiding his surprise, shrieked the party boy. His eyes ran fast, as happens from intense excitement. "Are you lying?" confidently said the guy, not letting his voice miss even a note of doubt in his own statements. "I'm not lying," exclaimed the girl again, stepping out by the guy's sleeve. "I know you slipped something into my cocktail and took advantage of my helpless body. You have to take responsibility for what you did. What, are you going to turn me into the police?" The young man grinned venomously. "Not if you agree to be a father to your child," Nancy said. "Not about to back down." "Now what am I supposed to make of this?" the boy grumbled squeamishly. "It is not necessary to restrain the impulse to claw at the young man's throat," Nancy said calmly. "But the child must have a father," said the last sentence. Nancy felt a lump of tears lodge in her throat, reminding her of her recent conversation with Charles. But she held on with all her might to keep from crying right away. "No way!" the brunette laughed. "Then you'll have to answer for your dirty deed to the law," the girl said discreetly. "I'm stating a fact." "You won't have to. You can't prove anything. On the cameras, everything looks as natural as possible, and coitus between women and men in such places is not new." The young man spoke fearlessly. Nancy became disgusted at what
the guy called romantic intimacy between two people. But her facial expression was not affected in any way, even though he looked as confident as possible. Nancy could feel the hesitation in his voice, as if he was defending himself with a counterattack.
Being unsure of his words, the girl noticed that the guy was about to leave. Them, at the same second, pulled out her passport from her bag and held it open to the young man's face. "And why are you eating this for me?" he asked indignantly. "Look at the date of birth, asshole!" The girl's patience was at its limit, and she sawed the guy with a look in anticipation. Mentally counting this, the creep, the brunette raised his eye full of horror at her. "You're 17?" he shrieked. Nancy noticed the last bit of hope melting away in his gaze and hummed contentedly. Now the coitus that occurred between us would look every bit as harmless. Unsurprisingly, suppressing a victorious chuckle, Nancy jerked her head up. "What's all this nonsense?" the boy exclaimed. "Who asks age in a club anyway?" He stiffened with surprise and realization of what a drastic mistake he had dared to make. A month had passed since then. Nancy and James, as it turned out, the name of the young man doomed to become a father at the age of 19, began to spend a lot of time together. Sometimes it seemed to the girl that the boy was beginning to fall in love with her. And for good reason. Because soon, when Nancy dared to tell James her guesses about his feelings, they started a relationship. Nancy also thought about the fact that the pregnancies needed to be told to her father. Waiting until the moment when the stepmother was not at home, the girl approached Charles. He was sitting on the couch as usual, keeping to the can of beer in his hands, occasionally drawing his lips to its neck to take a sip. The sight was truly pathetic. The man looked so weak that he was unable to continue drinking. Nancy Akor thought he was tired of it. And drinking alcohol that threw strength, just to forget that he existed in this world. Perhaps that was the case. Putting aside harmful thoughts about her father, which brought tears to her eyes,
Nancy confessed to Charles that she was carrying a child. The reaction was not long in coming. Jerk! The man set the can of alcohol aside on the floor and rose from the couch in a burst of footsteps, fatherly hugging his daughter. It came as a surprise to Nancy that the father began to actively help his daughter financially. Molly also resented the fact that her husband had begun to share the monetary income with more than just her, but she did not understand the reason. Charles began to drink a little less and spend more time with his daughter. Nancy began to feel that life was getting better. And so it was until her father left this world forever. It was soon enough. Charles' death turned out to be as worthless and ordinary as the last few years of his life. Molly found him dead on the couch. The man had an uncorked bottle of beer in his hand, and it appeared that he had simply fallen asleep due to severe intoxication. Molly walked around the house, wailing. Just when I thought you'd quit, I see you again. She kept walking around the apartment from corner to corner, choking on her stupid alcohol. Nancy was at home at the time and heard the arguing from behind the wall, but she didn't dare to interfere because she caught herself thinking that she agreed with Molly. Suddenly, the young girl heard a rumble from the bedroom where her stepmother and father were. Following the sound, Nancy caught a silence unnatural for this house. Jumping up from the couch, Nancy headed towards the sound. When she arrived in her parents' room, she caught this picture. Molly, clutching a kitchen towel, but not with rage as she had been a few minutes ago, but with a kind of fear suddenly appearing on her face. She huddled in a corner of the bedroom, staring at Charles, who also continued to sit in the chair, unresponsive to anything. He is dead, mechanically barely moving his lips, said Molly. Nancy froze on the threshold and digested the words that had just come out of her unloving stepmother's mouth. They echoed in her head. Dead. Coming to her senses, the girl shuddered and ran up to her father, falling to her knees in front of him. Nancy grabbed his hand, from which the bottle immediately fell out, rolling across the floor. Why? Why? Nancy repeated in a low voice. The one question that was forever lodged in her mind was, why? Why now? Was there no fear or regret in her heart? Only a mute question, directed into the void, troubled the girl. How are we going to be now? Molly's voice suddenly sounded. Nancy didn't even pay attention to her stepmother, realizing that the woman was only worried about herself at the moment. Fear to the farther. Molly was a fear only for herself. Now she would have no one to provide for her and gift her with money every 6 months. Now she would have to work to be able to feed herself. Her phrase, how will we be now? Nancy could shamelessly interpret it as, how will I be now? Nancy silently rose from her seat and not without effort suppressed the growing urge to diffuse herself and leave the room. Hey, where are you going? There was a squeal. The girl's stepmother did not want to be in the house, and gathering herself, she went outside. And Nancy wandered senselessly around the city for a long time. Growing circles around the same familiar neighborhoods she had known since childhood. In the long hours since the horrifying news of her father's death, the girl had not shed a single tear. She felt nothing, but at the same time a tsunami of unsolicited emotions raged inside her. The girl almost physically felt the vacuum that had erected a thick wall around her. She tried to abstract herself from the entire universe, which was pulling her into the very thick of pressing events. As if through a shroud, Nancy heard the sound of a cell phone ringtone. Nancy sluggishly reached for the phone and suddenly realized that she had been hearing that sound for an hour and a half. The display showed James. Nancy answered the call. Her voice was hoarse, and it seemed that only silence kept the girl from endless sobbing. Hello, lifeless, she answered. Hi, sweetie. Shall we go out tonight? The boy spoke affectionately but hurriedly. Nancy was silent. pondering the invitation or the wording itself. "Hey, kitten, but are you okay?" Once again, James's cocky voice rang out. "I'm not going," Nancy replied with a palpable desolation in her voice. "Are you mad that I still haven't given the money from last night's outing to your father?" At the word father, Nancy's heart skipped a beat, but the boy continued. "You know I'm honestly looking for work," James said pitifully. "And your dad has an endless supply of $5,000 bills." Did not stop sleeping over the guy, not naming him. So, with a note of irritation, interrupted James' girl. "How?" surprised the young man daddy trembling voice. "Either from the growing aggression or from the grief coming to the throat," said Nancy. "You've never been angry about it?" James was stunned. "You were the one who told me how he didn't care about you, how all he did was drink." Nancy was silent again. I restrained myself from plunging into the darkness, from my own memories. The girl said in as calm a voice as had the strength to make it so. "He's gone. What's it like for Daddy?" As if mocking, asked Volodya. "Stop it!" Nancy shouted hysterically. "Hey, little girl, what are you doing? Where isn't he? At home? He's gone somewhere." James started pelting the girl with questions. Nancy pursed her lips, listening to the boy's Eve's speculations about Charles's whereabouts. When the girl felt a trickle of blood running down her chin, she closed her lips and exclaimed, "He's not here at all." "James!" The boy was taken aback. After a moment's explanation, he fell into a long silence himself. Nancy begged him to come to her, to be near her. But James continued to be silent. When the girl was about to break down into begging and screaming, the young man's voice sounded horribly impassive. "Baby, you see? I can't come." "Why?" Nancy cried out bitterly. "Huh. I think it would be better if we didn't," interrupted Nancy, already guessing what was coming. "Speech! Let's break up!" Ignoring Nancy's exclamations, finished James. The girl slowly slid to the ground. She was in an empty courtyard, and no one could hear or see her suffering that she had to endure at the moment. She began to sob loudly. "Have you thought about the baby? Did you promise?" "Yes." All through her own tears, Nancy cried out in despair. On the other end of the line, instead of an answer, a mocking short beep sounded, indicating that the caller had hung up. Nancy wanted to call back, but James had blacklisted the girl everywhere. "Asshole!" sagged Nancy, threw the phone in the girl's direction. Didn't feel like going home. She was so desperate that life seemed to have lost its meaning. But remembering the baby, Nancy gathered her courage and wiped away the tears that wouldn't stop pouring in rivers down her red cheeks. She got to her feet and headed in the direction of the house, drowning out all thoughts of her father. Of the gray, now definitely lifeless in the walls, ready to take the girl into its cold embrace. James, who all this time was using her for money that she spent on meaningless hangouts, each time promising to return about everything that could bring Nancy exorbitant pain. She walked through the empty neighborhood to an apartment drenched in endless misery. Her stepmother sat in the kitchen, staring at one point with empty eyes. Still not for the tea she herself had made. Nancy walked inside, opened the refrigerator, intent on forcing herself to eat at least something. The doctors said it was cardiac arrest. Molly's cold voice rang out. Nancy remained silent. She swallowed her tongue harshly. But also aloofly, the woman asked, "It was your fault, wasn't it?" Nancy was confused at the accusation heard in her direction. What have I done? Without a shadow of self-pity or any emotion at all, Nancy replied. Molly rested her head tiredly on her palm and massaged the wrinkles on her forehead with her fingers. Their altercation was devoid of heatedness. As if they were both too lazy to prove anything, falling into an uncontrolled quarrel, as it had happened before, Nancy sank down on the chair beside her stepmother, losing all interest in her, put a bowl of last night's soup in front of her, and began to eat her dinner. The girl felt Molly's gaze on her, but could not make out its meaning. Soon, having lost patience, Molly threw a piece of paper on the table and thumped it loudly with a palm. Now for hours for talk through. Your order for hour. Auger. Constant. Nancy almost flinched in surprise, but didn't show it. After living a piece of potato, the girl looked up at her stepmother and was horrified at the evil grimace on her face. And in the glasses, it seemed, you could see the blazing fire of rage. What's that? Trying to be unperturbed, asked Nancy. Read it. Formidably, Molly held out the letter closer to the girl, setting the food aside. With shaking hands, Nancy unfolded the soft paper. She recognized her father's handwriting in what was written. Read it aloud. The commanding tone of the stepmother's voice rang out again. Nancy obeyed. Her chest squeezed out not a longing, not some other force, palpable on a physical level. I feel my hour has come. You have every reason to hate me, because right now. From that moment on, the shrift became even more Corellia and Nancy. I had to scrutinize every letter to make out what was written. I could call an ambulance, let anyone know of my condition, but instead I prepared to accept my fate. I've waited too long for this to give up. I wish things were better now. I know you would have to be disappointed in your father again. So let my end bring you relief. Our last days spent together, a joy. There's an envelope of money behind the hall closet. Take it, you won't need it. As she finished reading, Nancy felt her heart burned again by a ruthless annoyance. But the girl fought it hard. Glancing once more at Molly, Nancy saw her grin turned toward the unfortunate stepdaughter. She was unhappy that her husband had given all the remaining money bills not to her, but to her daughter, the girl child, whom the self-serving woman had not. Saw the most. Why? Molly exclaimed. Why did he leave the money to you? What have you done to deserve such condescension? The indignant woman started from the table and ran out into the hallway. Nancy staggered after her. The stepmother picked up the envelope of money and turned to the girl. You're not getting a penny out of this. Molly threw scornfully. I'm pregnant, pronounced Nancy, causing the stepmother to stiffen with shock that Molly looked at the girl in amazement. That's why he bequeathed that money to me. Without much enthusiasm, muttered the girl. After a moment's silence, Molly, like a cat ready to strike, started slowly approaching Nancy. The girl tensed with her whole body, but didn't budge. Nancy jumped up, screamed the women, lightning fast slapping the unfortunate one by one. Get out! Get out of my house! Nancy had never seen her stepmother before, so enraged as she was now. The girl became frightened beyond measure for her life and the life of her unborn child. Nancy staggered backward, deep into the hallway, crossed the threshold of her own room, and locked herself from the inside. For a second, the 17-year-old girl continued to sit on the floor, trying to get her still confused breathing down. Memories were slowly bringing Nancy to the present moment. A furious Molly was running back and forth across the apartment, shouting angry phrases, kicking Nancy out of the house. There was nowhere to go, and Nancy packed her things and left the apartment under the watchful eye of her stepmother. The girl kindly agreed to be taken in by a family, evicted. Having learned about what had happened, Bosworth was horrified and for a long time covered with not the kindest words Molly and James. Nancy began to communicate more often with Christina, thanks to whom the entrance for James to the night establishment was closed forever. Nancy cut off all contact with her stepmother. However, she did not try to establish a relationship. 3 weeks later, at the height of August, Christina invited Nancy to her recital at the Philharmonic. Nancy didn't expect the bartender of the show to be into something like that, but she readily agreed. Can I come with you? Bosworth asked. Are you sure you'd like it? Nancy asked hesitantly. What's not to like about a concert? Bosworth gave her friend an uncomprehending look. In spite of Nancy's attempts to convey to her what really included the essence of the forthcoming concert, Bosworth unreservedly began to pack. Crossing the threshold of the concert hall, the girls took their seats. I knew that there would be no inadvertent drinking here, Bosworth said, pulling out a plastic bottle of purple-colored liquor from her backpack. What's this alert? Asked Nancy. Take a guess, girlfriend, grinned Bosworth. Put it away at once. Do you want us to get kicked out? Nancy looked around in panic. Bosworth furrowed his brow, then kicked one of them out, asking, Since when are you so proper? The lights went out in the hall, the sound of the opening music blaring. Bosworth made herself comfortable in her chair, not removing the bread bottle from her hands. She held out the purple container filled with alcohol to Nancy, but she wrinkled her nose and put her hand in front of the bottle, refusing. Bosworth merely shrugged and touched her lips to the neck again. Today, you will watch the final concerts of our best graduates, proclaimed a solemn voice from the podium. I would also like to introduce our sponsors to you in advance. Ethan and Michael Chesterton are brothers and part owners of the largest musical instrument company in our region. Please, let's welcome them with a round of applause. In the auditorium, clapping increased in magnitude with each second. Two people, similar in appearance from afar, but clearly different in age, walked onto the stage. The first stood straight, truly as if he fancied himself the head of the Philharmonic, and the second in behavior, in appearance, was like a teenager Zadornov. His shirt was directional, his stance uneven, too casual for the occasion. It was as if he didn't care about anything that was going on around him. Bosworth, sitting next to Nancy, turned pale and nestled into his friend's ear. It's that guy from the club. Excitedly, she whispered. Nancy had to lean over so Bosworth could hear her. Which one? The girl asked. The one who bought me cocktails. When was the last time we went out with you? But where else is it, Not daring to continue, Bosworth laughed. Nancy lifted her head higher, trying to make out the young fellow's face. Indeed, he did. He awed Nancy, descending to his former position. The presenters continued to say something admiringly, but the girls were no longer listening, continuing to gaze into the boy's face to make sure that they were definitely not imagining things. The performance began. First, several members came on stage, one of whom played drums, another played electric guitars, and the third was obviously the vocalist. The instrument playing and the performer's voice were flawless. Nancy listened to them in awe, forgetting where she was at all. Bosworth, on the other hand, looked bored as she watched one musical debut meet the next. Occasionally opening her mouth wide to return it to her dullness, Nancy tried to ignore her friend, completely immersed in the nourishing air of the cultural atmosphere. But soon, Bosworth began to ride vigorously in her chair, occasionally undermining and out of her seat, scrutinizing someone. What are you getting angry about? Asked Nancy. Bosworth turned a questioning look at the girl, keeping a firm grip on the armrests, as if waiting for the right moment to bolt. Your eyes are glistening, Nancy observed. That's not good. Bosworth reacted indignantly. It means your druts suck! Nancy replied. Bosworth rose from her seat, glaring defiantly at her friend. Not true, the girl exclaimed, expressing an empty plastic bottle from her sinus. Disgruntled exclamations erupted from behind. Sit down, Nancy commanded. I won't! Bosworth laughed and ran towards the speakers. Nancy reacted instantly and rushed after her, finding herself at the foot of the towering stage where an unsuspecting group of girls were now performing. Nancy. I saw Bosworth, who was with his hands on the ledge, climbing to the top. Nancy glanced in the direction of the announcing girl and grabbed hold of her waist, pulling her down. Let go of me! Bosworth shrieked. Do you want security to take us away? Shouted Nancy. Bosworth, unable to hold on, collapsed to the floor. Nancy struggled to her feet at the last moment to keep from falling on top of him. Let him have it, and I'm bored! Bosworth shrieked angrily, looking at Nancy with starting eyes. Losing patience, Nancy grabbed the girl. Bailing these roughly pulled her behind her towards the exit. Bosworth only chortled as if she had lost her mind. Following the girls, Michael ran out. The same guy with whom Bosworth had been at ease about 2 months ago at the club. The door slammed shut behind him, and Nancy turned around at the sound, expecting to see a guard. That was great! The boy declared enthusiastically, waving his arms to the sides. Seeing the familiar, Bosworth staggered and fell silent. Nancy didn't know how to react to the young man's words, but she didn't have to. The stranger spoke again. As much as my brother grumbles, I believe you are fully justified. The amount of money we have invested in this event, brightening this meager evening with merriment. Exactly, Bosworth shrieked victoriously, glancing at Nancy. We haven't met before by any chance. Michael turned to the eviction, noticing how frightened she took in, and began nervously fiddling with her fingers. Pondering what to say, the guy laughed. Smoothing things over. It's okay. I won't tell anyone that you were scamming naive young men at a cocktail party, he joked back. But the girl was not amused by the joke. Not at all. Blushing, she threw. Calmly raised his palms in a conciliatory gesture. Would you do me the honor of becoming with a man who has in the contacts of the phone book your number? Artistically straightened. In the back, stepped the young man toward evicted. Just then, 2 men in security guard uniforms ran out from the side of the lobby. They approached the young men threateningly and ordered the girls to leave the building. I'll walk them out, Michael said with a smile on one side of his lips. Bosworth gave him her number, though, and after a while, they called each other. Days past Bosworth, Michael began to communicate more actively. The young man called the girl on a date, where he paid for dinner at a restaurant. He did not buy her expensive gifts, did not refuse her anything. It seems that Bosworth really hooked the guy with her reckless style. The school days began. Nancy's final year, year 11, was the last year of school. Nancy had always studied well, but because of her pregnancy, she had a hard time. Nancy was always absent in the middle of the aframstil of the day because she was not feeling well, or it was too hard to endure a few hours of sitting. Bosworth brought the girl extra assignments for absences, and she spent all her free time not on studying, but on walks with Michael or going to club parties. Nancy did not approve of Bosworth's behavior because her parents did everything possible to make their daughter comfortable to study. They were not as wealthy as Nancy's late father, but they loved their daughter freely and did not relinquish their parental responsibilities, in spite of their discontent to the deeds of the evictees. Nancy hesitated to pry. One day, Bosworth stayed out late at a nightclub. Nancy didn't wait up for her and fell asleep. Bosworth's parents worked at the same company and were often away on business trips. And this day was one of them. No one was home. Nancy closed the front door on the house key, knowing that Bosworth could open it herself, and went to bed. The girl awoke to some rustling in the apartment. Nancy thought it was Bosworth and tried to go back to sleep. But then from behind the door she heard whispering, and often they leave. A man's quiet voice sounded. Putting his finger to his lips, Bosworth whispered, "We are alone." "Staying in a light glow," said the guy. Not with all the seductive voice Bosworth stretched out. The door to the room opened. Nancy covered her eyes and equalized her breathing, pretending to be asleep. After a second's pause, the whisper of evicted was heard again. Sleeping. What the hell is writing? threw the young man Nancy's friend a disgruntled, quiet exclamation to herself, Bosworth, leaving the room and closing the door behind her. Nancy could no longer make out a word of what they were whispering about. Soon, faintly perceptible tremors were heard from behind the wall. Nancy, listening in the hope that it wasn't what she thought it was, caught the occasional sound of the bed creaking, covering her ears with her pillow. The girl tried to fall into sleep sooner. The morning when Nancy woke up, the strange guy was no longer evicted. As if nothing had happened, she sat at the kitchen table and chewed on a cookie. "Who was that?" Nancy asked aloofly, pouring tap water into an empty glass. "Who and where?" Without taking her eyes off the smartphone screen, reflected Bosworth. "Someone came in with you yesterday. It wasn't Michael, was it?" Nancy looked at the girl with a little elusive leer. Bosworth responded to her look. And for a second, a flicker of fear flashed in her eyes. "Not understanding what you idly said, Bosworth. What is it with you and Michael?" Once again, Nancy tried to get her friend out of it. The girl put the phone away and stared into Nancy's face with some challenge. "What do you want from me?" Bosworth asked in a suspicious tone. Nancy pushed back her chair, sat down beside him, and said gently, almost affectionately, "Nothing. I just want to make sure you're all right. You hardly ever tell me anything." "Are you acting like my mom right now?" Clutching the back of her chair, Bosworth exclaimed. Nancy fell silent in an attempt to find a suitable phrase, able to get Bosworth to tell the truth. "I have nothing with Michael." Bosworth's voice suddenly rang out, breaking the girl out of her musings. But how, unable to find the words to speak out? "Nancy, unfinished question?" "I don't like him, but I like his money." Bosworth pronounced the last word with a peculiar dreaminess. "But I like Seryoja, the one who came yesterday. I want to go out with him." "So you're just leading two guys around by the nose?" skeptically said Nancy. "I'm not leading anyone on," exclaimed her friend. "I didn't confess my love for Michael. He spends on me himself. Am I going to refuse?" Bosworth laughed. "Do you have to tell him the truth? You can see that he's really in love with you." Trying to talk some sense into her friend about the territory. "Nancy." "Yeah, I knew you wouldn't understand." He gritted his teeth and hurried out of the kitchen. Nancy was left alone with her thoughts. On the one hand, it was none of her business at all. But on the other hand, her friend was being very mean to Michael, who was completely sincere in his feelings for her. After this, Nancy catches Bosworth several more times for cheating on her with a strange guy, but she continues to keep quiet, only looking at her friend with reproach and some disappointment in the days that followed. Nancy was in the last month of her pregnancy, which was proceeding quietly enough, despite the longing and recoiling grief for her father, that gnashing a brutal body still freshly wounded. James remained at large, and Nancy thought, continued to commit his pernicious deeds not in favor of the girls. Nancy didn't feel like doing it now, but she promised herself that the father of her child would be condemned to her will for a long time to come. As soon as she got out of the maternity hospital, Nancy did not have the best and closest relationship. The girl kept barking at her friend for endless cheating and kept nagging her to tell the world the truth. But Bosworth only waved off her friend's chastisements. Lately, they had stopped talking altogether. It seemed to Nancy that Bosworth did not descend to quarrels only because Nancy was carrying a child, but as soon as she gave birth, she'd fly right out of her classmate's house. One late February evening, the girls were sitting at the kitchen table, in the company of Michael. He had come to check on Bosworth, and was now talking excitedly about something. Bosworth was aghast now and then, giggling at his jokes where needed, and Michael was smiling smugly. With a smug look at her lover, Nancy rarely got to see the lad in this house, and each time she pushed herself from the decisive step of telling about the church, the Commodore Yeaver, Bosworth relieved that they would work it out for themselves. With a little conspiracy, Michael pulled the ring case out of his pocket. Bosworth visibly tensed. It may not be a marriage proposal, the boy began, but let it remind you of my serious intentions. Nancy heard her friend's faintly relieved exhale. Bosworth leaned over to the young man and kissed his cheek, taking the jewelry from his hands, admiringly examining the shimmering diamond. No, suddenly even to herself, Nancy exclaimed. The young men looked at her in bewilderment. On Bosworth's face there was an intimidating emotion that said, "If you tell, I'll kill you." Nancy hesitated, but Michael continued to look at her expectantly. "I'm sorry, Bosworth, but I can't do this anymore," Nancy mumbled, intending to continue the dialogue. "Just try it." There was a threatening cry from the evicted, but Nancy, there was no stopping her. In one breath, she told Michael the whole truth about the friend she had kept in her heart for so long. The young man listened without interrupting. Then he raised his eyes to Bosworth, desperately trying to discern in them at least a hint that Nancy's words were lies. "Oh, she's lying about everything!" exclaimed Bosworth. The girl rose from her seat and moved toward Nancy with a firm, deadly gait. "She's like you, so she's telling stories out of jealousy." Turning to Michael, Bosworth was aroused. "She wants to ruin our relationship and bring you in." "Do you realize what you are saying?" Breathing heavily, Nancy asked, "What, do you think she's a complete fool? I don't understand anything." Oh, once again, Bosworth leaned threateningly toward the pregnant girl. Nancy did not look frightened. Rather, she was aloof, silent, bowing her head, as if in obedience to the eviscerated and greedily gulping air with her mouth as if in a seizure. "What's the matter with you?" Still proudly towering over Nancy, and in a lovely tone, Bosworth asked. Michael, too, was distracted by the news he had recently heard, watching Nancy carefully. The waters seemed to have broken. Still gasping for breath, Nancy, Michaela, and Selena looked at each other, as if agreeing with a single glance on a temporary truce. Taking Nancy under both arms, the young men dragged her toward the exit to Michael's car, sitting in the back seat in a semi-fainting state. Gusty, sighing in an effort to dull the pain, Nancy heard Bosworth and the boy arguing heatedly about something, but catching the gist of the conversation was an impossible task for Nancy. Upon arriving at the birth center, Nancy was immediately hospitalized, while Bosworth and Michael stayed in the waiting room. "And what do you believe?" the girl asked with a kind of insolent reproach. "I've suspected you of it for a long time. Now I just made sure that it was not in vain," Michael said, hiding the storm of emotions under the indifferent expression of his face. Bosworth sighed indignantly and came close to the guy so that he had to look her in the eye. "Then why did you continue to groom me? To give me expensive gifts? To talk to me?" Bosworth said in that nasty, amorous voice, expecting to piss the guy off. Michael's face seemed to start to blur into a grin of resentment, but he quickly got himself under control, took that in his green eyes and, unwaveringly, without a shadow of self-pity or even a hint of self-abuse, said because he loved. Bosworth broke into a smile and ran her hand over the young man's chest. "And are you going to let some words ruin your love? That is, our love," the girl said in a mesmerizing voice. Michael intercepted her hand, squeezed to the pain in her knuckles, from which Bosworth sobbed and growled. "Gladly, Lettuce," pushing the girl to the side, turned again to face the closed door of the delivery room. "Thinking about something." Bosworth threw in a rage. "In that case, passes to the TS to make sure I never see her feet in my house again." And Bosworth ran toward the exit, bursting into tears. Michael, on the other hand, remained in place until after Nancy's labor was over, when he was informed that in half an hour the girl could be visited briefly. The boy ran to the nearest flower store. Lying on the hospital bed without strength, opening her eyes, Nancy notices Michael entering with a lush bouquet of roses in his hand. The girl laughs hoarsely, trying not to burst into tears, and asks, You've been here so long. Don't worry, I've been out of my mother for much longer, the guy said jokingly. Yuck. Nancy jokingly wrinkled his nose. They looked at each other, as if silently encouraging each other. Then Michael crouched down next to the girl and said in a serious voice, "Thank you." Nancy was taken aback. For what? She flapped her eyes in surprise. For the truth, the boy explained briefly. They fell into silence again, as if they were mourning someone. Perhaps they were. They were both mourning love. For the first time in a long time, Nancy could relax and think of her father, without worrying too much about hurting the fetus developing in her uterus. Suddenly, a midwife entered the room with a baby in her arms. Okay, but that's it. Your lady of the heart needs to be with her baby. A stern but unpretentious woman. Yes, of course, but she's not mine. The guy wanted to object. A baby? Nancy shuddered in anticipation, knocking the young man from his thoughts. It's a girl. That's right. With a warm smile, the nurse confirmed, holding out her baby to the mother. The woman then turned to Michael and with one menacing glance, told him to leave. Watching the happy but tired Nancy, the lad was experiencing at the moment a host of strange, previously unknown sensations. But he was not allowed to be near Nancy any longer, and as if under hypnosis, he left the ward. The young man came to see Nancy again. After a couple of days, she looked much better, but the black eyes spoke of the long, sleepless nights she had spent by her daughter's side. Nancy smiled as she greeted Michael. I named her Miranda after her mother, Nancy said. Michael couldn't help but smile back, not knowing what he was so happy about. After talking a little on detached topics, the boy gradually brought the conversation to Bosworth, without informing Nancy that she was no longer going to give her a warm welcome at her home. I knew it would be like this, the girl said tiredly. Why have you been living at the evicted all this time? Asked the boy, in a heavy lump in his throat. Nancy, for the umpteenth time, began to recall aloud the terrible events that had happened to her 9 months ago. Memories of her father were given a throbbing pain in the girl's soul, but no longer caused tears as before. For the sake of the child, Nancy not only quit smoking and drinking alcohol, but also managed to cope with a zero. Tink. The death of Charles, and henceforth it was only a wounded memory on her heart, but no more. Having told her story, Nancy looked at Michael. It was obvious he was at a loss. You don't have to answer, Nancy shrugged indifferently. There has to be a way out, Michael shrieked. Why don't you call your stepmother? Nancy waved his hands. Even if she lets me in, I'm not going to raise my daughter in the same house with that lunatic. Negatively shook her head the girl. You're right, thoughtfully said the guy. I'll think of something. With these words, the young man rushed to the exit, gusty, saying goodbye to Nancy. The girl began to think how to be and where to go, because 18 she should turn 18 only in 3 months. Calling her old acquaintance Christina, Nancy began to tell her story in a hurry. But the girl only sympathized with the unfortunate, because she herself lives in a communal apartment with 3 other people. Nancy nodded understandingly. Still, she and Christina were not close enough to perform such services. Nancy thought hard, going back 2 weeks. What would I choose? Keep silent about the affair, Bosworth, for the sake of the child, and remain welcome in her apartment. But leave Michael to empty hope. Or not to change her fate, the girl thought. Having come to the conclusion that honesty is above all, Nancy again began to think over the further plan of action, without noticing how she sank into sleep. On the day of discharge, Nancy went to the head of the maternity ward to ask him to keep them for a few more days, until the girl could find options for living and earning a living. Upon returning back to the ward, Nancy finds Michael there with his older brother Ethan. The younger Chesterton runs up to Nancy in excitement, and without even saying hello, he mutters, "We've thought about it and decided that you're going to live in our house." "Take your time, Michael," came the menacing voice of the older brother. "We haven't decided anything yet, but we are mortified," the boy said. Nancy didn't have time to mentally follow the dialogue between the two brothers and didn't understand what was expected of her. Ethan Chesterton slowly approached the confused girl and said, as if to himself, "First, we need to call her stepmother and make sure there's no other option." "What?" Nancy exclaimed. "Why would we call her?" Michael gave Nancy a sympathetic look, then turned to her. "We sincerely want to help. Please let us do this." The tone in the guy's voice was soothing and inviting. "Will I live with you?" Nancy asked a little anxiously. Michael was a little embarrassed by the primate and the girl. The boy's older brother took the initiative of the conversation. "We live at my parents' house. Room for one." The man hesitated. 2 people are enough there. The house is not small. There is an extra room. Michael told me your story. "I don't think you'll Sawazaru Operi de Boru. Kurhawa. Very far without help. I'm willing to give you a place to live and work in our salon. Don't worry, you won't have to leave the house for long. There's a workshop inside for cleaning and polishing instruments." That's fine. But in order to make decisions like this, I have to be convinced that it is really so necessary in the waiting, looking the girl in the eyes. Finished, Ethan. "You don't believe me?" "Yes." Nancy smiled sadly and said in a low voice. Michael wanted to object, but the older boy interrupted his brother. "Isn't that normal? If you're really telling the truth, you have nothing to hide," said the older brother Michael, throwing Nancy a glance in the danksterole. "Gidaranestrai, direction of why, got the girl's cell phone lying on the nightstand by the hospital bed?" Sighing, Nancy slowly walked over to the nightstand. Michael exclaimed, "You don't have to do that. No, he's right." Calmly, Nancy washed her pitchfork, picking up her cell phone in her hands. The girl dialed Molly's number one way or another. Only took a second and put the phone to her ear. Out of the corner of her eye, Nancy noticed a satisfied smile on Ethan's face. The phone was picked up. Nancy's breath caught for a second, and she was not immediately able to speak on the other end. Neither was Silent, having put it on speakerphone. In an insistent whisper, Ethan called out. The girl obeyed, frantically placing the phone on the bed. Nancy asked, "Hello?" An exasperated sigh was heard from the receiver. "Girlfriend kicked me out." "Did she laugh?" Molly asked. "I'm at the hospital." "Can you come get me?" the girl asked. "No way. Deal with your life on your own." "How did you always do it so skillfully?" the woman concluded sarcastically. Nancy didn't know what to say and shifted her gaze to the guys asking for help. Before she could turn her head, Ethan was next to her. Michael came from the other side, staring glumly at the screen of his phone. Snatching the smartphone out of the girl's hands, the elder Chesterton spoke up. "Look, you are Nancy's legal guardian, and you are in no position to kick your stepdaughter out of the house, especially with a child in your arms." "Who's that?" In the same sarcastic manner, Molly spoke again. "A person who can sue you for failing to fulfill your duties as a guardian," threatened Mike. Molly hesitated, but only for a couple seconds, then said, "Well, then I'll give it up. That nasty girl has no place in my house." Her voice was terribly calm. Nancy had always thought her stepmother hated her. But now, the girl was convinced it was not hatred. Molly felt a blazing envy for Nancy. Envy because of the girl's childhood spent in love and tranquility. As far as Nancy knew, Molly had grown up in inhuman conditions and had not known what love was. Perhaps she had married Charles not for love, but because she was incapable of experiencing it at all and only wanted to find a place in the sun. Everything fell into place, and Nancy now looked at Molly, not as a mercantile woman who had ruined her life and deserved only hatred, but as a mentally ill person who was incapable of empathy and a danger to society. On some level, Nancy might even sympathize with her stepmother if she hadn't experienced the horrors herself. What could Molly have done to her? "Are you out of your mind?" "Hello!" Ethan exclaimed, trying to reach the woman. The phone rang and beeped. Michael and Nancy were silent. Ethan, on the other hand, was furious. The girl saw him walking, a look of shock on his face, and his chest rising and falling, trying to calm down. After a few minutes, Chesterton came to his senses and turned to the girl. "I'll get everything ready to leave tomorrow." The young man turned around and headed for the door, ready to leave the room. "In fact, today is Nancy's last day," Michael exclaimed excitedly, writing everything out. Ethan looked questioningly at the girl, looking over his shoulder. No. Nancy waved her hands negatively. "I've asked to stay in the ward with my daughter for a few more days until I find a place." Modestly, the girl cast her eyes downward. "Well, from tomorrow you will have it. Be ready," Ethan Chesterton said with the same stern intonation, and went out of the door. Nancy stood. The astonished ones did not dare to move from their seats and stared at their savior. Michael smiled proudly, and having said goodbye, Yurka followed his brother out of the doorway. The next day, everything happened exactly as Ethan had promised. Not only for Nancy, but for all the temporary residents of the maternity hospital. It was a surprise to see how many vintage and expensive cars had come to escort the girl. When Nancy went outside, there were hysterical jokes from everywhere about the convention and so on. Ethan Michael met her on the street. Waiting in his car, he gallantly opened the door for the girl. The young man invited her to change seats. "Why so many cars?" In a low voice, as if fearful of being overheard, asked Nancy, seated with little Miranda in the interior of the luxury car. "It was my idea," Michael said solemnly. Ethan only rolled her eyes at that. The young man continued, "I thought, let this holiday open the door to a new happy life for you." "A happy one," Michael said with some kind of enthusiasm. All the cars were indeed decorated with balloons and children's stickers. It was immediately clear to all passing people that inside the first car was a young mother. Entering her husband's house, the girl was speechless at the luxury she saw. "You live with your parents, don't you?" Nancy asked awkwardly. "As I said, we live in my parents' house, but not with them," Ethan emphasized, answering the girl's question. "My parents moved away, leaving us to inherit this estate." A moment later, a young woman dressed as a servant ran up to the young people. "Good afternoon. I need help getting the guests settled," she asked humbly. "Can you take her things to the room we've assigned her?" Ethan said calmly. The maid nodded and ran to the threshold of the front door, where an unfamiliar male driver of one of the presentable cars was carrying all the bags from the luggage. Nancy turned to look at them and mumbled anxiously, "Half of the luggage is not my stuff. There will be someone else with us." Michael laughed. Ethan only smiled discreetly. "No," replied the elder Chesterton. "We figured Miranda would need a lot of clothes," Michael explained, still smiling broadly. "But you got something too, didn't you?" The boy winked at the surprised girl. Thus began a new chapter in Nancy's life. She spent a lot of time in the brothers' house, working for them and taking care of her daughter. Michael did his best in everything, helping the girl to be there for her. During the time spent working with musical instruments in the house of the brothers, who, by the way, often took the girl to the Philharmonic for concerts, Nancy realized that she sees music as her vocation. When Miranda went to school, Nancy said that she was ready to enter a music university. Ethan helped the girl with that. In fact, the girl became almost family for her. When Nancy managed to settle in his own apartment, Michael did not stop visiting the girl. He came to her home then with flowers, then with other gifts, helped in bringing up Miranda. Earlier, the guy thought that he did it solely out of warm, friendly feelings for Nancy. But then he realized that the young man really loved her, told Nancy about his feelings. And the latter reciprocated, admitting that she has long been partial to Michael. As for Molly, she repeatedly tried to make up with Nancy when she learned that the girl lives far from poor and closely communicates with millionaire brothers. At first, Nancy wanted to believe her stepmother, but the signs of deception were too obvious. And when Nancy spoke her worries aloud in a phone conversation with Molly, the woman began to heatedly yell at her stepdaughter, saying she wasn't worthy of living. Molly, and wished her daughter Miranda all the worst, which is scary to even say out loud. Nancy consulted with a psychiatrist, and the stepmother was taken to a mental institution. It turned out that the woman lived not in the most favorable conditions, doing that begging money from passers-by for bread. And cases of refusal could attack a person and start beating. Molly was often kicked out of the jobs she found for the same reasons. The woman was many times registered with the police history, or with the police, and once it came to the point that Molly almost had a criminal case. The woman was diagnosed with psychopathy in a mental hospital and is now undergoing treatment. Nancy, as intended, succeeded in getting James jailed for several years. As Nancy suspected, he continued to slip a powder into the girl's cocktails for his own perverse needs, which, when mixed with alcohol, causes severe dizziness, disorientation, and memory lapses. Despite the fate, which previously treated the girl cruelly, Nancy was able to pull herself together and overcome all the obstacles on the way, and give herself a chance for a happy life. Now, Nancy lives together with Michael, who takes great care of both her and her daughter. After the black streak in the girl's life finally began white, and Nancy will do everything to never let go of her happiness, no matter what other trials await her along the way.